In 1995, in the industrial city of Detroit, an impossible crime unfolded. $3.8 million in cash vanished from the steel jaws of a private safe inside the director's office of a high-end car dealership. The dealership was not just any showroom, it was the regional hub of General Arthur McConnell, a decorated military veteran who, after 30 years of service, had transitioned into the world of private security consultancy and luxury automotive sales. The safe was massive, 4 feet tall and 3 feet wide, weighing nearly half a ton, secured with both a mechanical code lock and a secondary electronic authentication. Cameras watched the hallways, logs were written and duplicated in paper and digital form, and night patrols circled the compound every 30 minutes. Yet in the early hours of one summer night, the vault opened, the money was lifted, and by dawn 2 expensive vehicles were missing from the dealership's lot. The impossible had occurred. Before we sink deeper into this story, remember, nothing in this tale is as straightforward as it first appears. The time was the mid-1990s. Detroit was wrestling with economic decline, unions cracking under pressure, and corruption infiltrating both public and private security structures. The dealership was a bright island of wealth amid abandoned factories. Designed in postmodern fashion with steel beams and mirrored glass, the building had a peculiar duality, a showroom of light and shine in the front, and a labyrinth of corridors and locked doors in the back, where the safe stood inside McConnell's office. His office was a shrine to power, dark wood paneling, a massive oak desk, shelves lined with medals, commendations, and signed photographs with generals and governors. In the far corner stood the safe, a Mosseler Imperial, painted gunmetal gray, sitting directly on a reinforced concrete pad. It was tall, wide, and bolted into the floor. Inside were bundles of cash. The dealership was a point of laundering for military procurement, slush funds, used to make off-the-books purchases during the Balkan conflicts. That explained why so much money in $100 bills wrapped in brown tape was locked away in a civilian car dealership's vault. Each package weighed nearly 20 kilograms, stored in hard canvas sacks, creating a total weight that made physical removal improbable without industrial tools. Cameras recorded every entry. Guards kept logs, time-stamped, duplicated, and cross-checked with McConnell himself. On paper, the system was airtight. McConnell, 61 years old in 1995, was the embodiment of military rigidity. He had joined the Army at 19, served in Vietnam, and climbed through logistics and procurement commands until reaching brigadier general. Known for discipline, not charisma, he retired early to enter the booming private security business of the 1980s. By the 1990s, his dealership and consulting firm were fronts for multiple operations, some legitimate, others murky. He believed in routine, checking the lock twice, smoking exactly 1 cigar after closing, and writing a single line in his leather-bound diary every night. If truth must be said, "I am tired of shadows," one entry would later read. His downfall was not carelessness but trust. Inside his staff was an accountant's assistant named Daniel Price, 34 years old, quiet, overqualified for his job. Price had once been a systems technician at a defense contractor, until debt, divorce, and gambling pushed him downward. At the dealership, he managed invoices, payroll records, and had limited clearance for the digital systems. He was invisible, but he saw everything. His position allowed him to know shift changes, the timing of audits, and where duplicates of security tapes were stored. He was the inside man. The organizer was different. Marcus "Red" Callahan, a former Marine, dishonorably discharged after a violent altercation. In Detroit's criminal underworld, Red was feared for precision and cold nerve. He had contacts for vehicles, forged IDs, even access to specialized lock equipment. When he met Price, their fates aligned. One with knowledge, one with muscle and logistics. Together they planned the heist for over a year. There was also an unexpected witness. Harold Jenkins, a maintenance contractor and part-time janitor who lived 2 blocks from the dealership. A man in his late 50s, Jenkins often wandered near the lot at night, scavenging scrap metal. On the night of the robbery, his insomnia would place him directly in the path of a detail investigators would puzzle over for 15 years. The night of July 22, 1995, began normally. At 2:12, the night guard wrote in the log, "Corridor clear." Cameras showed nothing unusual. At 2:27, the code was entered into the safe's digital lock. The system registered authorized access. At 2:31, the Mosler's heavy door swung open. At 2:37, sacks were lifted and replacements, weighted with metal scraps and blank paper, were dropped into the cavity. At 2:45, the safe door shut again. Procedure should have caught it. The duplicate logs should have revealed discrepancies. The tape should have shown two men hauling sacks. Yet the logs were altered, time-stamps shifted by Price himself, who had learned the quirks of the system. The camera feed was looped using a primitive but effective VHS overlay device. Grainy, static-filled footage replayed while the theft occurred. Red hauled the money into a dolly reinforced with belts. Price handled the logs and swapped keys. A small van waited at the side exit. They had 23 minutes from start to finish. When dawn came, the dealership was silent. At 7:02, the day staff arrived. At 7:18, McConnell entered his office. At 7:22, he lit his cigar, opened his desk drawer for a lighter, and noticed a faint scrape across the carpet near the safe. At 7:25, he spun the dial, entered the code and pulled the handle. The safe felt lighter, its echo wrong. He pulled open the sacks and paper slipped out, blank, cut to resemble bank bundles. His hand trembled. "This is not possible," he muttered. He sat down. Then he called the police. By 8:04, Detroit PD was on site. By 9:11, the FBI field office had been notified. Reports were filed, but questions multiplied. How could 2 tons of cash vanish from a sealed office? Why were the logs clean, the cameras unbroken? And who dared rob a general's safe? Twist number 1 came that afternoon. A neighbor reported seeing 2 expensive sports cars racing away from the dealership lot at 3:10, a cherry-red Ferrari 348 and a black Mercedes SL 500. Both belonged to the dealership's inventory. Neither should have left the lot. Yet their VINs were already flagged as sold in the computer system. Price had doctored the records. Twist number 2 emerged days later, when an internal auditor found McConnell's diary entry dated July 19. Funds must remain hidden, even from those who ask. Too many questions in Washington. Was the theft simply opportunistic, or did it cut into an unofficial war chest? Weeks later, a janitor's statement surfaced. Harold Jenkins swore he had seen 2 men lifting something heavy into a van that night. Investigators dismissed him as unreliable, but his testimony was archived. Twist number 3 unfolded a year later, when an anonymous envelope arrived at the FBI's Detroit office, postmarked Chicago. Inside, a photocopied map with a series of numbers written in cipher. The note read, "If I vanish, find the river." The signature was a single letter, D. Price had vanished shortly thereafter. For 15 years, no trace of the money, the cars, or the men surfaced. McConnell aged, retired, and withdrew from public view. Red's name circulated in whispers, but no proof tied him. The case became legend in Detroit, a myth of money that evaporated. But in 2010, a final twist shattered silence. During a demolition of an abandoned warehouse outside the city, workers found a steel locker sealed shut. Inside, wrapped in decayed canvas sacks, were papers, dealership logs, partial bundles of aged bills, and a notebook. On the first page, in shaky handwriting, "If they find me dead, look in the lake." That discovery reopened the entire case. And it is here, at this point of unearthed memory and cryptic confession, that our first chapter ends, with more questions than answers, and the shadow of 2 men who stole millions and disappeared into the night, leaving behind nothing but silence, fear, and a trail of ghosts. 15 years after the night when 2 men vanished with $3.8 million from the Detroit luxury car dealership, the case still lingered like a ghost in the files of the FBI and local police, marked unsolved but never forgotten. And in 2010, the discovery of the steel locker in an abandoned warehouse reopened every wound, every question, and every suspicion. For inside those decayed sacks and notebooks, investigators saw not only fragments of dealership logs but also cryptic entries that suggested a larger network, an implication that the robbery was not merely the desperate act of 2 men but a carefully shielded operation intertwined with hidden military funds and private corruption. And as agents reconstructed the events, they retraced every step of the original crime, reviewing tapes, interviewing surviving guards, and re-examining the tampered security systems. And it became clear that Daniel Price had built redundancies into the dealership records, shadow copies and falsified sales logs, creating a fog that had concealed their escape routes. and yet the rediscovered notebook hinted that his partner Marcus Red Callahan had not trusted him fully, lines scribbled in uneven handwriting reading, "He knows too much, he talks in his sleep," fueling the theory that the two men had eventually turned on each other, and the Bureau began to look not only for evidence of where the money had gone but whether Price himself had been eliminated, a casualty buried under layers of silence. Meanwhile, General McConnell, now in his late 70s, was summoned for questioning, frail but lucid, and he spoke slowly of old debts, of Washington pressures, of funds that had to remain invisible, confessing that part of the cash had been intended as unofficial channels during the Balkan conflict, but he denied any knowledge of who inside his own dealership had betrayed him, though his diary revealed fear, with lines like, "The shadows are closing, the walls whisper, if they find the locker they will find me," and investigators considered whether he had in fact staged part of the crime himself, a theory impossible to prove yet haunting in its logic. While back in Detroit, the legend of the stolen Ferrari and Mercedes lived on, sightings whispered at street races in Chicago or Miami, engines roaring at midnight, but no hard evidence ever surfaced. And yet in 2011 a break came when the black Mercedes SL 500 was located in a storage facility in Nevada under a false VIN. Its paint stripped and odometer rolled back, and inside the trunk detectives found fibers matching the canvas sacks from the safe, a direct link that proved the trail had never truly gone cold. And as forensic teams scoured the car, they found a single fingerprint, partial but enough to confirm Marcus Callahan had handled the vehicle, reigniting a nationwide manhunt. And the more they dug, the more inconsistencies appeared, including financial transfers from shell companies in Eastern Europe back to small accounts in Illinois under Price's brother's name, suggesting Daniel had survived at least long enough to launder part of the fortune. But questions remained about loyalty, betrayal, and disappearance, because Callahan's reputation for cutting ties violently meant Price's silence could have been enforced, and still the anonymous envelope with the cipher map haunted investigators, its phrase, "Find the river," pointing toward hidden caches near the Great Lakes, sparking searches with divers and sonar, yet yielding only wreckage and rust. And as agents pieced together the evidence, they began to realize the heist was more than theft. It was a mirror of systemic weakness, a story of how military funds blurred with private greed, how personal desperation merged with organized crime, and how two men, invisible to society, managed to wound an institution built on control and surveillance. And while the recovered locker provided fragments, it did not reveal the fortune. So the myth of the missing millions endured, whispered in bars and precinct houses, and then came another twist when a retired guard admitted under oath that the night of the robbery he had been ordered to step outside for a 10-minute smoke break by an unidentified supervisor, a break not in his official schedule, implying an additional accomplice within the chain of command, someone who had never been named or charged. And with that revelation the circle widened, suggesting that the two thieves had not acted entirely alone but within a framework of silent approval. And perhaps that was why for 15 years the trail had been protected, the silence maintained, because exposure would have implicated more than thieves, it would have pointed toward the very structures meant to guard the vault. And the deeper the investigators pushed, the more dangerous it became, files redacted, witnesses recanting, until the line between truth and cover-up blurred completely, leaving the story unfinished, wound in the record, a question hanging like smoke. Was this the work of two desperate men or the surface of a much darker architecture of hidden money and vanished loyalty? In the years that followed the rediscovery of the locker and the fingerprint on the Mercedes, the case of the 1995 dealership robbery grew into one of the most complex and politically charged investigations Detroit law enforcement had ever seen, because it was no longer about two men and a safe but about the cracks in institutions, the silences of generals, and the shadows of an era where billions flowed through unofficial channels. And by 2012 the FBI's cold case unit had constructed a timeline so detailed it spanned thousands of pages, charting not only the night of the crime but every bank transfer, every forged registration, every whisper of a sighting, and yet the money remained elusive, a phantom sum that seemed to surface only as rumor, and pressure mounted from Washington to close the file quietly, but younger agents refused, determined to push until the truth emerged. And their persistence led them to an abandoned cabin in rural Wisconsin where hunters had discovered a buried steel trunk in the frozen ground. Inside were weathered bundles of cash totaling just under $300,000 along with a pistol registered to Marcus Callahan, and this discovery was the first physical recovery of stolen money since the heist, proving that at least part of the fortune had been hidden piecemeal, perhaps as insurance, perhaps as betrayal, and analysts began to build the theory that the two men had split not only the money but the very future of their lives, one seeking anonymity through laundering, the other clinging to power through fear, and the contradictions became sharper when they traced Callahan's name to a series of private security contracts in South America under assumed identities, suggesting he had transformed himself into a soldier of fortune, living off the blood money of Detroit, while Price's trail led only to faint records of wire transfers, cheap motel stays, and finally disappearance, and the tension of the case built toward a conclusion. When in late 2013 agents received an anonymous tip from someone claiming to have been close to Price, the caller said simply, he wanted to confess before it swallowed him whole. He wrote everything down, and within weeks investigators found themselves holding a handwritten manuscript left behind in a safety deposit box under Price's mother's name, and that manuscript was the crack in the silence, because in it Price described the planning, the execution, the fear, and the paranoia that followed. He wrote of the moment when the safe opened, the way the air smelled metallic, the sweat on Callahan's brow, the heavy thud of sacks against the dolly, and how afterward nothing felt like triumph, only a rising dread, and he admitted that the plan had never been about cars or fast money but about exposure, about forcing those above to acknowledge the corruption flowing through their hands. But once the money was in the van, the idealism vanished and greed took over, and Callahan's violence made every day a calculation of survival. Price wrote lines that investigators read with a chill. If they find me dead, it was him, not them. I only wanted to escape the shadows, but he wanted to become one. And those words reframed the story, not as a partnership but as a doomed alliance, and the final pages ended with coordinates scribbled shakily, numbers that led to a desolate stretch of shoreline along Lake Erie, and when divers searched the indicated area they found a weighted container rusted through. Inside were degraded documents, dealership log pages, and fragments of burned currency, but no millions, and still it was enough to prove that Price had tried to hide evidence, perhaps from Callahan, perhaps from himself, and this led to the climax of the investigation when in 2015 a DA operation in Colombia intersected with a private airstrip used by ex-mercenaries, among them a tall red-haired man with faded marine tattoos and an alias too thin to hold fingerprint. Scans confirmed it was Marcus Callahan, aged but unbroken, and his capture was broadcast quietly back to Detroit, the city where his myth had begun, and when interrogated he refused to speak, smiling faintly, saying only money burns, loyalty rots, nothing else matters. But his silence could not erase the evidence, and in 2017 he stood trial in federal court, the proceedings thick with secrecy, witnesses shielded, files redacted, but the verdict was clear. Guilty of conspiracy, theft, money laundering, and obstruction, yet no full recovery of the $3.8 million was ever made, only fragments, caches, and trails of ash, and the unanswered question remained: had Price truly died, consumed by his partner's wrath, or had he vanished into anonymity with his share, because no body was ever found, no death certificate ever filed, only whispers, and in Detroit the story became cautionary, a tale parents told about ambition and shadows, about how even the strongest locks can open if trust is broken. And in his final years General McConnell sat alone in his house, the dealership long closed, his medals tarnished, his diary ending with a last line dated 2016. If the river swallows secrets, let it keep mine. And so the case of the dealership robbery ended not with a neat recovery or heroic justice but with silence, fragments, and scars, a story without clean edges. A mirror of a time when corruption blurred into crime and two men walked into the night carrying sacks heavier than their souls, and though one was caged and the other erased, the legend lived on, because money that disappears never truly dies. It lingers in whispers, in hidden ledgers, in the hum of engines that roar down empty roads, a ghost of fortune reminding everyone that control is an illusion, and that in 1995 for 23 minutes in Detroit, two men defeated a system built to be unbreakable, leaving a mark that decades later still refuses to fade.